It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC CQ27G2 or CQ27G2U depending on your region, the OSD on-screen display menu system of that model. The OSD is controlled by pressable buttons on the underside of the monitor towards the right side. You can see there are these faint little button labels there, just some engraved button labels, not really visible in most lighting to be honest, but if you look closely you can see them if you've got a little bit of light in the room. There's also a power LED, little power indicator. You can see this small triangle shaped pinprick design there. It glows white when the monitor's on, and a medium orange shade if signal to the system is lost and the monitor goes into standby. If you press the first button without entering the main menu system, you can cycle the inputs used by the monitor. You can then select something in the menu by pressing the fourth button along, which is actually the main menu button. It also acts as enter, whereas the first button is basically exit, and there's a left and right arrow in the middle of those. If you press the left arrow on its own, you can select the game mode used by the monitor, and I'll go through them in the main menu system. If you press the right arrow on its own, so that's the third button along, you get this little on-screen crosshair. You can just enable that or disable that by pressing that button. You can't change the design or anything like that, just on or off. The fourth button along allows you to enter the main menu system, which I'll do very shortly, and the fifth button along is the power button. The main menu is laid out in AOC's usual widescreen style, usual for most of their monitors at least, and it has been since I think it's 2011. That was the last time they changed the menu system, if I recall correctly. And navigating the system with the buttons can be a little bit tricky because, as I said, you can't actually see the button labels, and also it's just not really as intuitive as having a joystick for most people. When you first enter the main menu, you can see that there's a left and right arrow along the highlighted section of the menu, so there's luminance there, and if you press left or right, so that's the second button or the third button, you can enter a different section of the menu. But if you want to go deeper into a particular section, for example the luminance section, you then press the fourth button, which is the main menu button, so the button you press to get into the menu in the first place. Then you get deeper in, and you then use the left and right arrows to select one of the settings there that you want to be changing, and then you press the fourth button again to enter to get deeper into the system, and then select that specific setting and start changing it. Or if you press the first button, which is the source select button, that's how you get back to where you were before. So that's the back button, in other words. It's all explored in the user manual. If you need a reminder, you get quite used to it. I'm certainly used to it, but I've used a lot of AOC monitors before with this kind of system. So the luminance menu allows you to change things like the contrast, the brightness, eco mode. So this just sets a preset brightness and it locks off the brightness and contrast control. It's not really particularly useful to be honest, but there's text, internet, game, movie, sports, and reading. Reading's a bit different. You can see everything's gone monochrome. There are three different gamma settings, gamma 1, gamma 2 and gamma 3 as explored in the review. There's DCR, dynamic contrast ratio, also explored in the review, dynamic contrast setting. Next there's HDR mode, or what's called HDR mode. To be clear, this isn't an HDR capable monitor, so it's not using an HDR color signal. This just has an effect that looks a little bit like it could be HDR to some people, I guess. And that's because it enhances the saturation, or it boosts the saturation, and it also applies a sharpness filter, which is quite common when you're actually running HDR. But again, you're not getting an HDR color signal, so you don't have 10-bit precision for your games and your HDR content. You don't have a wide color gamut put to appropriate use, and you don't have any advantage in terms of increased brightness or local dimming to enhance the contrast or anything like that. So there's nothing really HDR about these, but they do affect the image and they apply filters which some people might quite like. There's HDR picture, HDR movie and HDR game. Basically they have a similar effect. The main thing they change is an ever-increasing sharpness filter. So picture has the weakest sharpness filter, HDR Movie applies a sharpness filter, and HDR Game increases the sharpness further. Really has a very artificial look to my eyes, and I think most people would agree. But the way that it increases the saturation is quite interesting. It's not a digital saturation boost, so it doesn't just pull things close to the edge of the gamut. It does it by altering the gamma curve at certain points so that it increases the vibrancy and depth of certain shades without affecting the shade variety as you would get when you increase digital saturation. There is a digital saturation setting called game color on this monitor, which I'll get to shortly, but this doesn't apply that. Really, this monitor is a wide gamut monitor anyway, and that gives you sort of a natural boost in saturation. I don't think most people will want to be using this setting, and they might not agree with the sharpness filter either, which you can't disable. But by all means, have a play with it. You might happen to like what it does to the gamma and how it affects the image, but it's just not for me. And actually, I've just played around with it a little bit more. It's not just the sharpness that's changed between HDR, picture, movie, and game. There also seems to be an increase of saturation with each respective setting. So HDR game being most over-sharpened and most oversaturated. And by the way, don't worry about that cross-hatching pattern. It's not on the monitor, it's just moire from the camera. Next is color setup. You can change the color temp, the color temperature setting. So there's user, which allows you to access the red, green, and blue color channels. Warm, which is the factory defaults. Normal, which really gives things a cool tint. So the color temperature is too high, and it certainly was on my unit anyway. But just different color channel adjustments it will make for you, but you can't access the red, green, and blue color channels and manually adjust them. Cool, which gives things a cool look as you'd expect, so a very high color temperature. And sRGB, which is an sRGB emulation setting. So that does cut down on the color gamut, and that's explored in the review. Next is DCB mode, Dynamic Color Boost. This is a digital saturation enhancement, so what it does is it increases the saturation by pulling shades closer to the edge of the gamut, and that means you get a reduction in shade variety, so you're not expanding the gamut itself. Full Enhance, which really affects all shades, or most shades. Nature's Skin, which focuses more on the red shades, the reds and pink hues. Green Field, which focuses more on oversaturating those green elements and bringing them out. And then there's Sky Blue, which focuses on the blue shade. So if you look at the Microsoft Teams logo there, for example, that changes a bit, or it certainly does to my eye when I'm using the Sky Blue setting. Auto Detect is supposed to look at the content and decide what to do based on the content. But if you prefer a natural and varied look to the image, I would recommend just leaving that off. And there's DCB Demo, that will just give you a split screen, and it shows you the kind of effect that the DCB can have on one side of the screen versus disabled on the other side of the screen. So once you've enabled that, set the DCB Demo on, you can then cycle these different modes, and the left side of the screen will show you what they're doing versus the right side of the screen showing you what happens when DCB is disabled. Next is Picture Boost. This puts a frame on the screen. You can see it just towards the top left there. You can adjust the brightness and the contrast of this frame independent of the rest of the screen, but of course this is a digital brightness adjustment. It doesn't change the backlight brightness or what the backlight's doing, so if you change this you're basically just going to lose contrast if you change it too much. So it really just floods the image and affects the gamma. It's a digital brightness control if you increase that. If you decrease it, it's just going to make things look really quite dull. The backlight brightness is still the same. But the reason you might want to do this, you might want to select a specific area of the screen and highlight that. You can adjust where on the screen this little box is displayed. You can adjust the horizontal position and also the vertical position. You can see the box is there now. You can also adjust the size of the frame if you want. You can have it filling the entire screen, and you might want to do that if you are someone who likes to tweak things a lot and wants to really change the whole image for the whole screen. So this will affect the gamma and other things. I would really recommend just looking at the test settings and the calibration section of the written review for some suggestions. On this model, you really shouldn't have to make these adjustments and you're just going to be upsetting the image. But if you do want to do this kind of thing and fine-tune things according to your own preferences, then this is what you can do with the bright frame setting. Next is OSD setup. You can change the language that the OSD is displayed in, the timeout period, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD will automatically collapse in on itself, or you can just press the exit button, the source select button a few times and it will disappear. You can set that between 5 and 120 seconds in increments of 5 seconds. DP capability, 1.2 is the default, that gives you the full functionality of the monitor. For compatibility purposes, if you've got an older GPU, you can select 1.1 there. You can change the horizontal and vertical position of the OSD on the screen. You can change the volume of anything connected to the 3.5mm jack or for the integrated speakers if you're using them. And I should mention the integrated speakers are only on the U model. They're on the CQ27G2U but not the CQ27G2. So the U means it has integrated speakers amongst a few other things. Next is transparency, which changes the transparency level of the OSD. You can set that between 0 and 100, depending on your preferences. I'm quite happy with 25 myself, which is the default. Break reminder, that will give you a little message on the screen after you've been using the monitor for an hour, saying you might want to take a break. If you press a button on the monitor, the break reminder will then disappear. USB charge, this is only applicable to the U model again, because there aren't any USB ports on the base model without the U at the end. But this means you can connect things to the USB ports and have them charging. And that will draw a little bit more power. So I'm not actually using the USB ports, so I have this set to off. If you have this set to on, there will be a little bit more power draw from the monitor, even if you don't have anything connected to the USB ports. So it just slightly increases the power consumption. Next is game setting. Some more interesting settings here. There's game mode. So there's various different settings here. FPS, RTS, racing, Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3, or off, which is my preferred setting. Off gives you full flexibility. You can adjust the luminance and the color setup menus, which I've shown you earlier. If you select FPS, you can't adjust many things yourself in the game settings sections. So you can't adjust shadow control or game color or even overdrive. These are all grayed out and set to values which I don't think are very good at all. At least for the overdrive, I should say. But it also locks out the luminance menu, or most of the luminance menu, everything but those HDR modes, in fact. And color setup is also grayed out, so you can't access the color channels. And it really just upsets the image balance. It oversaturates things to digital saturation enhancement again, so you lose lots of shade variety. It also applies a slight sharpness filter by the looks of things. So just upsets the image in various different ways. The RTS setting, the same, but it actually has an even more pronounced oversaturation. The FPS setting, by contrast, isn't so bad in that respect. RTS is really quite overblown. Racing, I think, is even worse again. It's really crushes shade variety, makes things look very cartoonish, and again, you lose access to lots of these settings. Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3, they again make different adjustments, but you have full access to the luminance menu. You also have access to the game setting menu, but you cannot access the color setup menu, so you can't change the red, green and blue color channels. So I don't really see why you'd want to use these rather than the off setting. It would be nice if you just had full flexibility, but I suppose you might want different sets of settings for different games, and that's where Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3 come in. But again, it would have been nice if you could have full flexibility with these settings. So I'll now return to my preferred off setting. Shadow control. So this is a gamma enhancement feature which is designed to improve the visibility for dark shades or dark areas of the game or whatever it is you're doing. This isn't an accurate representation of what the monitor actually looks like firsthand, but it will give you a nice idea of the relative effect of this setting. So 50 is the default. If you increase that at all, even to 60, it completely floods the image. It does increase your visibility in the dark areas, but it also affects pretty much every shade you could imagine. and makes things look completely washed out. You can increase that further, but it has an even greater effect. So really, this isn't as well tuned or as targeted as some settings of this nature, like BenQ's black equalizer or the black equalizer setting or similar setting on some models from other manufacturers. It's really quite a poor implementation, pretty useless to be honest. You can decrease that to 40, but then as you can see, you just have a massive amount of loss of information for those dark shades and things are just far too blended. Next, there's low input lag. This is only available if you have adaptive sync disabled, so adaptive sync set to off in the OSD. But for my testing, it doesn't really make a difference. If you've got adaptive sync enabled in the OSD, the input lag is still low, certainly is at 144 Hz. So if you're using the monitor normally and you want to use adaptive sync, then don't worry about the fact this will be grayed out. It's basically enabled anyway. Next is game color. So this is the digital saturation enhancement I've been talking about earlier. So if you increase that, you pull shades close to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. You therefore lose shade variety and you don't gain any extra saturation for the most saturated shades, but it does increase the saturation. This wallpaper is actually a very good example of this. You can see that frog there looking really very vibrant and completely unrealistic and unnatural when you increase the game color very much. You might want to decrease that as well. That takes a bit of edge off saturation. If you decrease it completely to 0, you get everything monochrome, just like using that reading setting for eco mode that I showed you before. Some users might actually like to tone down things a little bit because of the naturally fairly wide color gamut of this monitor. So that's where you might want to set game color to say 8 or 9. But the issue I have is even if you set it to 9, some elements look a bit muted and others look quite full in terms of their saturation levels. So it's not really very easy to get the balance right, but it can still help for some people. So some people might prefer how it looks with that set to 9 perhaps. Next is low blue mode, low blue light settings. And these are explored in the written review. Reading is the strongest setting, but there's various other settings, multimedia, internet, office as well. So I like to use the reading setting myself for my own personal viewing comfort in the evenings. It's important to cut out blue light in the hours leading up to sleep, because otherwise your body is in an alert state, which isn't good when you're trying to unwind and relax and have a good restful night's sleep. And that's where this kind of setting is particularly useful, but others might find it just more restful during the day even, or at other times. And for that reason, it can be quite useful. And it does work well. And as I said, I explore this in the review. Next, there's overdrive, the pixel overdrive setting of the monitor, the grey to grey acceleration if you prefer. This can be set to off, weak, medium or strong. There's also a boost setting, which is available if you've got adaptive sync set to off. And that's because it activates MBR, motion blur reduction, which I'm going to go through shortly, or at least show you very shortly. So if you've got this set to boost, what it actually does is uses the strong overdrive setting and also sets MBR to 20, which is the maximum value. I know that isn't reflected by what the slide is showing, but it's definitely what it does. I've tested it quite a lot. Adaptive sync, on or off. I'm not going to set that to on, just because I want to show you MBR very shortly, so that would be a waste of time. If you have adaptive sync set to on, you will see that MBR is grayed out because you can't use both at the same time. There's a frame counter setting. You can set this to right up, right down, or left up, depending on where you want this to be displayed. And although it says frame counter, it's actually a refresh rate display. So you can see that towards the top right there. It says 144 Hz. If you're using adaptive sync, then this will change according to the frame rate of your content. And I show that a bit in the video review. If it's within the variable refresh rate window of the monitor, so between 48 and 144 Hz if you're using AMD FreeSync, for example. So that's where the FPS counter function comes from. It does act as one if you've got adaptive sync and you're in the window of operation. Another thing worth noting with relation to refresh rate is that it also affects how the menu feels, or how quickly it responds, I should say, how laggy it is. So at 144 Hz, it's fine. But at lower refresh rates, it actually feels really quite laggy. I'm just going to change that to 60 Hz for you so I can show you. So the menu system is now a lot slower to respond. takes a while to actually get to the different sections. It's really pretty sluggish. And interestingly, when you've got adaptive sync enabled and your refresh rate is changing, it also affects how responsive the menu is. It's a bit of an odd system, to be honest, to have it connected in that way. It's not unique to this monitor. I've seen it on various other AOC monitors, and I think some from other manufacturers as well. So it's a bit strange, but you kind of get used to it. And my advice would be to just not spend too long in the menu system. Just set things up as you like, and hopefully you don't spend too much time in there. So I'm now back at 144 Hertz. Things are a lot quicker. So NBR, motion blur reduction, the strobe backlight setting. If you're sensitive to flickering, you might want to look away. Hopefully it'll be okay, but it is going to cause the screen to flicker, and that's because when I enable this, the screen flickers at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display, so 144 Hertz at the moment, or you can set it to 120 Hertz or 100 Hertz and still use this setting. And a high level of this setting reduces your brightness. So this is your brightness control. You can't adjust brightness by other means. This is now your brightness control. And it also improves the motion clarity using a higher setting. So I explore this in the review and what this does. So I'm not going to go through it again here, except to show you that you can adjust that in single unit increments. And if you enable adaptive sync, you can't use NBR, as I mentioned before. Next, there's extra. You can select the input used by the monitor or have it automatically select it for you. Auto config, that's just relevant to old analog connections. This monitor doesn't have a VGA port, so it's really just a hangover from AOC models that do have this. They just sort of keep some settings in the menu even if you can't access them, which is a little bit weird, but that's how it is. Off timer, so this means that after a given amount of time in hours, the screen will automatically switch off. You can set that between 1 and 24 hours. Image ratio, that's grayed out if you're using adaptive sync, so I'm going to disable adaptive sync and show you what this does. So I've got adaptive sync disabled. You'll see it now says V frequency 144 Hertz instead of just saying adaptive sync there, as I said before. It also shows you the resolution you're running at, just for reference. But you'll see that that setting is still grayed out. It's just set to wide. That's because it's actually relevant to non-native resolutions, so I need to also change the resolution. I'm going to change it to Full HD. And you need to select a resolution from this list where it says Ultra HD, HD, SD. That's what it's called on NVIDIA GPUs. These are the resolutions which you'd also get if you're connecting to another device, and they are also available on AMD GPUs, of course. But it means you can select the Full HD resolution at various different refresh rates. I'm going to select 120 Hertz, which is the highest you can do there. And you'll now see the monitor is using an interpolation process, using all of its pixels, mapping this, and this is explored in the written review. But the nice thing is that the image ratio setting is now available to use. So you can set wide, as I have now. You can select 1:1, which is a 1:1 pixel mapping feature. That means it's only using the pixels called for in the source resolution, so 1920 by 1080 in this case. And the rest of the pixels on the monitor, they're just black, so you get a big black border around the image instead. No distortion or anything like that. Everything's just sort of perfect Full HD in the middle there, or whatever other resolution you happen to be running. There are also various different settings which would simulate different screen sizes and aspect ratios. These would generally make more sense if the aspect ratio closely matches the resolution you're using. So in this case, it's 17-inch 4:3. Everything just looks squashed up and a bit weird. There's also 19-inch 4:3, 19-inch 5:4, 19-inch 16:10. So you'll see things aren't so squashed up now, although there is definite softening going on. So it's now just simulating a 19-inch 16:10 screen. 21.5-inch 16:9. 22-inch 16:10, so quite a few different options here. 23-inch 16:9, 23.6-inch 16:9, Don't think there are too many more. 24-inch 16:9. And back to the wide, which just uses all of the pixels. Next, there's DDC/CI, part of the plug-and-play functionality of the monitor. It allows you to use software to control the monitor. So for example, you could use AOC G-menu, which I'm going to show you very shortly, to control the monitor. You don't need to have USB connected. Of course, that's just as well because the non-new model doesn't have any USB ports anyway. And there's reset, which resets everything to the factory defaults. So onto G-menu, which most people will probably find is a much nicer way of controlling the menu system, because the menu system, for reasons I've explained, is a little bit annoying, to be honest. So when you open G-menu, you can select one of the game modes very easily. Or if you have it set to custom, you can click on advanced and you can set various things manually. So I'm not going to go through all of this in too much detail because I have shown you this before and I don't want this video to be far too long. You can really sort of see that you can access a lot of different settings here. Something worth noting though, if you select sRGB, you shouldn't be able to adjust the gamma because you can't adjust that when you've got the sRGB emulation setting active. If you try to, it just completely messes everything up, as you can see. But if you select one of the other settings, which isn't sRGB, then go back to it, everything's normal. Just don't touch that gamma. Should really be grayed out. Another thing that should be grayed out in the sRGB setting is brightness, because you can't adjust that. So for some reason you can adjust the slider, it should really be grayed out, but it doesn't actually do anything. So you can set that to 0, but the brightness is still at the default 75. And you'll be able to see that in the main menu system. Brightness is grayed out. Sorry, 90 is the default with this setting, but you get the idea. Grayed out, it's not actually changing it. You can also import and export various different sets of settings. So if you've got some things you like, then you can just quickly recall them here. If you don't want to actually go into the main G-menu application, if you right-click on the desktop, you can see there's AOC G-menu listed there now. Tune Display will just open the application up completely, but you can select one of the presets quickly if you prefer. You can do the same by going into the taskbar and right-clicking the G-menu icon there. Next is Game Sync. This allows you to set different presets to different games or different applications. Unfortunately, you can't have any extra custom settings, which would allow you to fully customize, as I showed you before. You've got the Gamer 1, Gamer 2, and Gamer 3, but that's not really quite the same thing. There's also desktop Game Sync mode, and what that'll do is it'll give you a different set of settings for the desktop versus everything else, or when you're playing specific games. And because I'm not a big fan of the presets, I don't really care for any of this myself, but you might find some utility in it. Low blue light settings, so you can quickly activate the low blue light settings. They activate very quickly and very quickly change them, so that's quite nice. Eco modes, you can select one of the eco modes. You can see that there isn't reading here, although you could get the reading mode, which was just black and white in the main menu system. Although, as I mentioned, I don't really see much utility in these settings anyway. You can just manually adjust the brightness instead. Extended eco features. This gives you some unique functionality. There's an idle timer, so you can set the screen to go dark after a certain amount of time. Or a power timer. So after the screen's gone dark, say after 10 minutes, another minute after that, the screen will automatically turn itself off. So it'll enter a low power state. That's quite useful. Could be quite useful. You can set this between 1 and 300 minutes, and you can set this between 1 and 120 minutes. There's also a power schedule feature, so you can have the power turn off, so it'll enter a low power state at a specific time on a specific day. So if you aren't going to be using the monitor after 4 PM, for example, or at 4 PM, you can have it automatically turn off on specific days. So that could be quite useful as well, I suppose. He says whilst disabling it for himself. Next, there's display, and this allows you to change some of the things related to G-menu itself. You can see various different things there. A few different settings that you could access in the OSD sort of miscellaneous settings like the USB charging option, and that kind of thing. Sync messaging, just as it might not be clear, that means it will, well actually if you go on help it'll tell you what it means. It says a notification appears in the task tray when the mode is changed while switching from one application to another. So there you go, that's what that does. Input select, so you can select HDMI port 1, HDMI port 2 or DisplayPort. Edit hotkeys, this can be quite useful actually. You can assign different hotkeys to certain functions, so you can have mode, brightness, shadow control or line out volume changed with hotkeys rather than having to go into the menu system to do it. So it can be quite useful for brightness, for example, so you could have Control Alt and up arrow or Control Alt and down arrow to change the brightness. So I've just done that. You don't have to have the application open in the foreground, although it does have to be an application focus. So if you're running a full screen application, you can't use these hotkeys. It will then minimize the game, or you'd have to minimize the game and open up a G menu, or at least be on the desktop. So if you're on the desktop, you can certainly do this. So you can see I can quickly decrease the brightness or increase the brightness. You'll hopefully see the screen doing something, although you won't see exactly what it's doing. And that adjusts the brightness in increments of 10. So it can be quite useful. Unless you're fussy like me and you like to select a brightness of 75, so you'd have to do that manually. You can also change the refresh rate used by the monitor and the resolution and the aspect ratio settings, although as you will be aware, I'm currently using Adaptive Sync. I've got Adaptive Sync active, perhaps you're not aware, but I do. And that means that, and I'm using the native resolution, so you can't actually do this. This isn't going to do anything. So you'll see it's just using the full screen, as you'd expect. But if you did have Adaptive Sync disabled and you were running a non-native resolution, you would be able to use this ratio setting here to control it from G menu. But you can certainly change the refresh rate and resolution very quickly. And that does indeed work properly, as you can see. And there's window transparency. So this just allows you to change the G menu system itself, so it has a bit of a transparency effect going on. High is a bit ridiculous in my opinion. You can just about read things, but whatever. If you want that, you can enable it. So that's really all there is to G menu and all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC CQ27G2 or CQ27G2U. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.